padají brejle, já se omlouvám. Dobrý večer, vážené obecenstvo. Vítám vás v Centru architektury a městského plánování. Dnes budeme mít takový komponovaný večer, takže s instrukcemi se hlásím nejprve v češtině. Dnešní program se koná v rámci festivalu Film Architektura. Takže vás tady vítám dvojnásob, pokud nejste fanoušci kempu, ale jste fanoušci filmu architektury, tak vítejte v kempu. My se dneska podíváme na přednášku Urban Talks s kolektivem Rotor, to je docela očekávané, a potom bude probíhat projekce takové site-specific série krátkých filmů od filmařského dua Ila Becka a Louis Lemois. Vy jste tady už mohli potkat mnohokrát s jejich filmy a dnes tomu nebude jinak. Potkáte je tady potom i naživo v případě, že se budete účastnit té projekce. Ta projekce bude následovat tedy po přednášce Urban Talks, takže pokud jste se registrovali i na ní, tak tady potom budete moci zůstat. Pokud ne, tak budete případně potom opouštět sál tady po těch schodech, aby se tady to publikum mohlo vyměnit. To je jenom pro vás takhle čistě organizačně, takže vás tady ještě jednou vítám. Jsem moc rád, že jste si na dnešní akci udělali čas a jak už je zvykem, tak Urban Talks probívají v angličtině, protože máme většinou zahraniční hosty, takže aby jsme si dobře rozuměli a bude následovat potom samozřejmě i diskuze. Welcome to another edition of Urban Talks. Today with the Rotor Collective. We will have here our dear guest Tom Schonians and Victoria Van Kaan from Rotor Collective, as I mentioned. And we would like to introduce you their work, of course, so you will have a chance to find the core of their inspiration and the processes that they use while they're reusing materials and creating new ones, for example, a new construction, new structures from reused materials. And it's also the topic that you will see in the documentary series that we will screen after the lecture. The series of film was presented at the exhibition Rotor Entangled Matter, produced by Beaux-Arts and A+ Architecture in Beaux-Arts Center for Fine Arts in Brussels, if you heard about it. So maybe you know about this project, and maybe you will be able to ask questions even about the film itself, even if you didn't see it today. And for almost 20 years, the Brussels-based collective has been demonstrating an alternative approach to materials and work and design things of it. So, as I mentioned, today guests Tom Schonians and Victoria Van Kaan, and I would like to introduce them here. Please welcome them on the stage. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everyone for coming out on a Friday night for us. And the film is by Becka and Lemois, of course. And thank you to CAM for inviting us to an amazing venue and an amazing city. We will talk to you tonight about the work of Rotor, which is a Brussels-based organization. And we will actually intertwine within the presentation of our work also some themes that were particularly important for the exhibition that we made, for which the movies you will see later on were actually produced. So it will not be a too traditional presentation of our work, but we're hoping to give you a good introduction for the films as well. Now, my name is Tom, and I'm with Victoria, and we are actually representing two organizations tonight. On the one hand, we are a non-profit organization which has been around for 20 years this year. We are mainly involved in, on the one hand, research projects. For the last couple of years, those have been mainly European subsidized research projects with a focus on the reuse of building elements. And then on another hand, we are also involved in many, you could say, consultancy projects where we assist architects and building owners with integrating reuse in their projects. In between, we also do some design and some exhibitions once in a while, like the exhibitions for which the film was made. But it's important to say that we are not actually architects. We scale up reuse through these consultancy projects, but our design projects are on the scale of the interior or a temporary installation. And maybe I will just let you quickly introduce Rotor Deconstruction.
Hi. So Rotor Deconstruction is kind of the little sister of Rotor. It was founded in 2016, and what we do is the more practical side of reuse. So we would do the dismantling of materials, reconditioning them, cleaning them, and then reselling them at our storage place that you can see over here.
So we're about 20 people at the site of Rotor Deconstruction and 13 people on the side of a non-profit. We are sharing a site, we are colleagues, but we're also two very distinct organizations, but we will talk about some of the activities of both organizations. Actually, we're very thankful to be invited to this building because it's an excellent case to introduce our talk. We've had a very nice tour of the building. We learned it was built by Karel Prager, which seems to be one of the most prolific architects in Prague in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we also learned that after its construction, actually a couple of prolific architects had their studios here. So it seems quite an extraordinary place to have a center for architecture. But actually, I want to talk about this type of building because it's clearly a local iteration of a type of building that most people in Europe will know, namely a 1960s, 70s celebration of steel, glass, concrete, and probably also aluminium in this case. Materials which you could consider as products of fossil fuel abundance. And an architecture that also very much celebrated these, at the time, modern materials as a way forward, as the announcing of a future. Now, if you see buildings like these in urban centers, particularly of old European cities, it's probably worth asking yourself what buildings have had to make way for it, right? Because with this architecture, which carries a very optimistic view of the future, often came a very strong disavowal of the past, or maybe just simply a disinterest in the past. So I think in this case, a couple of apartment buildings have had to make way, but the apartment buildings here are quite big, so it might have been an entire city block, I'm not sure. I think Rotor was invited today as maybe a representative of a new way of thinking about the future, in which we are called upon as architects not to make the same mistakes as in the 1970s, to start anew, but to take care of what has been built before us, to kind of learn to inherit these buildings, including their mistakes, and including the individual materials that the building is made of. Actually, we've had some experience with 1970s office buildings in Brussels. So we'll speculate maybe a bit on what you could call a so-called circular renovation of this building might look like. Now, I understand that the building will actually be renovated. So maybe we can already look forward already. So let's assume the building will be renovated. I think it will, and we will try to dismantle some materials. Now, if your building was designed by a good architect, a famous architect, chances are you have some nice, high-quality finishings. This is a picture of a bank building where Rotor Deconstruction dismantled a lot of materials in the very early days. Where they dismantled also a lowered ceiling, which had a quite high resale value. I've seen very nice materials in this building as well, and some very nice doors, door handles, nice staircases, nice architectural details. Maybe your building will have a couple of intrinsically high valuable materials, such as natural stone. I've seen those here as well. Stone that was used as wall cladding or facade cladding. And which are just, inherently durable materials. You can recut them, rework them, and if you're lucky, you might also get your hands on a couple of type of stones or exotic stones or exotic woods that you would not find anywhere else if it wasn't in these older buildings. Then if you've run through the, let's say, the best sellers, the materials for which people might want to pay because it's a part of the building, you get to maybe a bit lower value materials, which might be interesting nonetheless. Maybe the building was fitted recently with some LED lightings or other technical installations. There are definitely some here, which might be useful for the renovation or someone else in another project. Or maybe some other more banal, but nonetheless very durable and reusable materials, such as ceramic wall tiles from the 60s and 70s, which will generally dismantle quite easily. And if you're really not too sure what to do with your materials and you don't think anyone outside of this project might be interested in, you can always organize a giveaway. If you give materials away for free, people will come and pick them up. We can assure you. But then, when you run through the bestsellers, you will actually notice that even on the level of finishing materials, a lot of materials will actually not be fit for reuse, and there can be 101 different reasons for them. It could be because they are too fiddly to dismantle, because they are toxic. There are 101 different applications for asbestos. You will always be surprised. Maybe because the materials don't comply to certain contemporary standards or norms, etc., etc. So actually quite big flows of materials will end up being treated as waste anyway. And then you might say, well, a proportion of those materials might be recycled. That's true, probably. But we know, and it's not something that we proclaim, but this is something that is generally accepted, that recycling will not conserve actually much of the value that is in an element. You are losing the energy that was invested in creating the element. You are losing the cultural and historical value of an element through this process of recycling, which also takes a lot of energy. And then when you're done with the finishing materials, the real volumes of materials start moving, even in a renovation project, because you might find that in a 1970s office building, your floor-to-ceiling ratio or height, your floor-to-ceiling heights, are not really up to contemporary standards, are not high enough to fit all your technical installations, and you might want to get rid of your screeds, which will create thousands of tons of concrete rubble. You might also want to get rid of interior partition walls in masonry. And then, of course, the facade will have to go as well, because these facades from the 1970s, they don't perform as well in terms of conserving the energy to heat and cool the building. And in many cases, if your building doesn't have a particularly patrimonial interest, the owner will like to have a new face to the building by reconstructing the facade. So actually, if you zoom out, you will see that even in a renovation project where you conserve large parts of the structure, large volumes of materials will move and will end up as waste. Nonetheless, the owner of the project might promote the building or the project as a circular pioneer because of those few reuse operations we did, which were significant, so it's not unjustified that we can call this these circular actions, but they might be blown up a bit. You might call this a form of circularity washing or greenwashing. And before you know it, your logo will kind of feature as a stamp of approval between other well-known sustainability labels. So there's kind of a discrepancy here between a discourse within rooms like these on circular construction and the amounts of materials that are actually moving, even in renovation projects. And this, of course, is happening on a much larger scale as well, as I'm sure you're aware. We are producing more and more demolition and construction waste every year, while we are extracting more and more raw materials every year, a large part of which for the production of concrete, sand, and gravel and stone to produce cement. Up until the point where we actually produce more man-made materials on this planet in terms of weight than there is living biomass. And of course, the final boss of these statistics, the proportion of CO2 emissions that the construction sector represents globally, which is up to 40% now. I'm sure most of you are probably now aware of the ideas that these statistics represent, and maybe some of you already know them by heart. So this is really the scope of the talk tonight, to kind of deal with this discrepancy, which is actually summarized quite well by this quote by Erik Swinnegedouw. I'm not sure if everyone can read it, but I will read it for you. He's a Belgian scholar, and the quote reads, "While the climate issue is acknowledged and confirmed, no effective change or action is undertaken. In French, je sais bien, mais quand même. I know, but still. I know all too well what needs to be done, but nonetheless I act like I don't. The desire towards an ecologically sustainable, climatically stable and just society concentrates in a thing that replaces the desire itself, just as a fetish does." Swinnegedouw talks about, of course, society as a whole, not particularly the construction sector. Then he says, managing emissions becomes the stand-in for something else that's considered too big, too unwieldy, too unknown, too frightening, and or too attainable. So somehow we are left with this reality of being stuck in a linear economy of extraction and exploitation, and on the other hand, actually a realization of all these frightening statistics and this reality, and we don't really seem to be able to do anything about it. What we will try to do tonight is point to a couple of, I mean, we're not going to sell you a worldview or a big solution, but point to maybe a couple of themes that today are maybe under-discussed when we talk about circularity, and that might address some of these too unknown, too frightening, or too unattainable factors. Maybe that point to certain discussions that are maybe too hard and that we are actually maybe avoiding today.
So one of those underexposed topics is the link between circular construction and innovation. And closely connected to that, something we will talk about later is the role of manual labor in these practices. So if you saw the films of Beka Lemoine before this talk, you will probably have noticed how much these topics are present in their work as well. And those are topics that are also very present in our own practice. So these days, a lot of funding goes into the circular construction. They very much tie circularity to innovation. And most of the time, innovation means digital innovation. So those two ideas got very closely linked, especially through projects like things like European Green Deal, etc. But this is for us not exactly obvious, this link. So if we take a step back and look at some examples from the past, one we used to, we like to use is this image from the early 20th century. It shows demolition sites in Brussels in 1928, to be precise, when the Palais Granvelle, along with quite a few other buildings, had to make way for an ambitious north-south railway project in the city, in the center of the city. So this is, of course, a very regrettable demolition. But if you look closer, it's also an evidence of something else. The dismantled material looked quite decently sorted on site. And if you look on the left, you even see a sign reading facade materials for sale. So this means that the materials were sold directly on the demolition site without even passing through any other storage facility. So this is quite remarkable if you think about how construction works today and what circular future we want. And this is, of course, long before all these sophisticated tools, circular economy consultants, material inventory softwares, marketplaces, etc. Yeah, so even today, actually not demolishing and salvaging materials for reuse doesn't require very high-tech innovation. So we learned that from our experience, but even more from salvage materials dealers that existed before and that are still around today. So a lot of them have disappeared over the past century, but some of them managed to stay in business somehow. And that passing of know-how and knowledge actually inspired one of our long-lasting and longest-running projects of Rotor, which is called Opalis. And Opalis is kind of an online telephone book for professional resellers of reclaimed materials. So we launched it in 2012, and today it's co-managed with Bellastock from France. So officially, it focuses on dealers in northwestern Europe, so Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. But actually, we have, thanks to schools, collaborations with schools, for example, we have a way larger network of dealers, which we hope and we might one day officialize and be able to put on the map. So the project actually began as a response to a public initiative in Brussels that the city wanted to create a new facility at that time for reclaimed materials in the city, but instead of inventing at that moment something entirely new, Rotor proposed to research and map what already existed. So on the platform, you can look for materials through location, but also through material type. You can find some inspiring case studies and projects, and also find some references about reuse and circular economy in general. Yeah, so most of the companies on Opalis we actually visited ourselves to see what they have in stock. In many cases, you need to visit them to actually know what they have to offer, because you cannot find a lot of things online. But also to have a conversation on their experiences, on their way of working, the materials themselves, etc. So in general, those dealers really, they know their materials really well. And the information we got from them, it's extremely valuable to understand reuse and to be able to know whether reuse is feasible or not. So this was a big base of our knowledge. But what all of these dealers have in common is that they fulfill a crucial need to storing materials. So they all have a big stock. Because they basically bridge the gap between the moment a material comes out of the building, which is unpredictable, and the moment someone can use that material in a new project, which is also unpredictable. So having a more or less stable stock solves the most important uncertainties, which is, will I find the buyer for my material, or will I find the material I need for my new project? And this is what storage solves. So by visiting all of these yards, you quickly notice that each material has its own context, its own story. And it is very hard to generalize the reuse market. Just to elaborate on this example, reclaiming bricks, for example. It's a very common practice in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So it's actually only older bricks that are laid in mortar, so they can easily be physically reused. But they're also very wanted. So one of the dealers once talked about red gold, which means actually the supply of these old buildings is diminishing. So most of them have been demolished, so the source is, the market is getting way more competitive for these resellers. And also many dealers, their clients are quite wealthy wealthy clients that wish a rustic look, which those old bricks give by definition. But of course, there are also newer manufacturers keeping up with that and providing simulated bricks with simulated patina. I mean, so you have that as well. So these are other examples of other yards: doors, steel, wood decks of boats, terracotta, roof tiles. But many of them also treat materials, so sorting them, for example. In this case, this is a cobblestone dealer that sorts the cobblestone by size or type. In that case, it's clinkers, which are ceramic paving tiles, which is an extremely durable material. Research shows that the average age of such a clinker is 125 years old, years, so that's quite a lot for a material and could be reclaimed a lot of times. But many of these operations still require a lot of manual labor, like the process of brick cleaning. So reuse in that sense is a bit messy. Many used materials are irregular sizes or they need a specific attention. And often only the human eye can really judge if the material is or not reusable. So just a side note on this, like a good brick cleaner can actually clean 1,000 bricks a day. So that means a large pallet you just saw before. And we have found some documents dating back from a couple of centuries that mention more or less the same amount. So that means it's really like a profession that never really changed and that kept doing its thing until now. Denailing, also a form of treatment. You don't want customers to break their blades when they cut your reused wood. This is surface treatment. In this case, it's stone, but you could also imagine treating wood, cleaning ceramics, repainting radiators, etc. This is a cobblestone you just saw before. It's cut in two. It's actually quite of an intelligent innovation, I would say, of one of a few cobblestone dealers that actually, by cutting them in two, you kind of get two surfaces. And you also make the cobblestones from the street meet new standards. For example, they are more friendly for wheelchairs, buggies, bicycles, etc. So one side is flat, and you can still use the smaller part on the opposite side, and then you have like the patina of decades of road traffic. So you actually double the range of your product. So that's, we kind of like this story. So this is where Rotor DC enters in the picture. So the research on Opalis showed what already existed, but also what lacked, namely a local urban actor interested in more contemporary materials. So that is how the activities of Rotor DC took off. We noticed this lack, but also the necessity to be implicated ourselves in the reality of construction. After having done mostly research and exhibitions, we wanted to jump in the reality. And I guess to tell something about the location, it's quite challenging in terms of logistics, but one of the choices we made is to really stay in the city. Most of the productive activities they actually leave the city. But if you look at where materials come from and also where materials are used again, so in the city, it makes a lot of sense to have a local actor processing them. So we actually moved to this place and 2-3 years ago, and this is for the first time more or less permanent location after having moved our stock a few times in the last years. So what you see here is quite a normcore office park, which is originally absolutely not a place to be handling materials. So it was quite a challenge in itself to make this building our new home. So over the last 2-3 years, you saw a lot of changes happening to the building. You saw the parking spots has been changed by pallets of materials. The bikes have been changed by bicycles. The greenery has started to do its thing. So yeah, it's really fascinating to see how such a site can change in a business park. This is a part of the storage place of Rotor DC, so you really have to see Rotor DC in its Brussels context. So densification of residential neighborhoods and also a very competitive office market, which makes a very mixed supplies of material coming from older single-family houses like these doors to big office buildings of the 60s until up the 90s already, actually. We have a lot of materials from the 90s. So we do dismantle ourselves. This is a bit of a coincidence, but this year we did quite a lot of gymnasium floors. We never did it before. But we do not necessarily dismantle everything. So we often share the work with demolition contractors. That do the biggest work. A fair part of our stock also comes from overstock deals, also consignment sales brought in by individuals or small contractors doing renovations themselves, which brings more variety in our stock. In other words, we are not restricted to big batches of technical doors or large quantities of the same material. So that's how we fill our stock. And talking about large quantities, sometimes we get quite surprising batches that are very large quantities. Like what you see here is a radiator cover, which was widely used in office buildings from the 70s in Brussels. Buildings that are at this moment many of them are being refurbished. So we got a lot of these panels the last years. It's a very specific product. It's round, like you cannot find it like this on the market. It's also very durable. It's very good multiplex. And it's something designers got really excited about. So at one point, they were kind of popping up everywhere in Brussels. We were also not the only ones getting our hand on one of those towers, so they were circulating in Brussels. So it was really a big mine, you could say. And somehow this specific panel marked a period in Brussels, which was very local level. But like the beginning of the 2020s was really marked by this curved panel used everywhere in temporary locations, etc. And I've been hearing some designers and people just being really bored of this material and not being able to see them anymore. But by not doing the dismantling ourselves all the time, we can also focus on steps that are just as essential for reuse. but which require a very specific know-how, such as cleaning and reconditioning certain materials. Take the toilets, for example. So I think Tom showed the building before, Multi. So imagine this tower, like 20, 30 floors high, with at least 4 toilets on every floor. So that's a huge number of toilets you can take out of just one building with one renovation. So toilets are not the easiest material to put back on the market. Cultural perception play a role. And also, yeah, to be honest, it's just not very exciting to reuse a second-hand toilet. But anyway, we tried to make this work. So we applied for funding to experiment on deep cleaning these toilets. And a way to remove the lime scale inside of the ceramic toilet. You see here, this is a specific workshop line we developed at one point, where you plunge the ceramic toilet into acid, and then a few days, and then it just takes off everything, and it comes out almost as new. We realized it was too much work in the end to make it cheaper than a new toilet, so we stopped. But we still use this technique for other ceramic products like tiles, etc. Then, yeah, we take our lighting workshop, where we also repair lights. So most of the fixtures we reclaim. They cannot be resold as they are, so they need to be recabled. They need to be changed to new LEDs, LED standards, and sometimes the model is just old-fashioned, or yeah, we redesign somehow the model with old parts. And a lot of our work, finally, large part of our daily work consists of like managing our stock. So yeah, how much material is left in our stock? Where is it stored? In what condition is it? What is the weight of the batch? Can it be transported or not? And we all do this through our website, which is for ourselves, but also for the clients. And where everything gets a really precise description. So the more precise you are, the better you can make reuse work. So as a conclusion for this part, managing a stock of materials or basically doesn't require way more than a dedicated space, a motivated staff, fairly standard stock management tools, and basic transport. All of this kind of already exists or can be tweaked a little bit to adapt it to the specific needs, but there is nothing really high-tech involved in what we do at Rotor DC, at least. So a second blind spot in today's circular economy debates is the role of manual labor, and yet it's absolutely central. So most of the circular activities, especially reuse, depend on it. Salvage materials, preparing them for a second life, cleaning, repairing, it's really not suited for automation. For example, to give one example, this is a terrazzo facade slab you can see here. They came from a renovation of a social housing district in Paris. They were installed in 2013 and already dismantled in 2021, between 2021 and 2023, as part of like a thermal renovation project. And over 3 years, this kind of slabs arrived in our warehouse gradually. But not all of them were in the same conditions. So some of them were perfect, others were chipped or cracked or completely damaged, actually. So then you have to sort them. At one point, you have to reimagine categories to sort them, because not all the category fits with other materials. So it's every time reinventing the thing, but it was completely worth it because we knew there were a lot of slabs being able to come. So for example, here you would say quality A is something you can reuse immediately for the same original use. Quality B means that there might be a chip or crack on some borders, but with a simple cut, you could reuse them, and we can guarantee that a big part of the palette is decent. And quality C means you need to be creative. It's very heterogeneous. It's also very cheap, and you can only pick them on site. But that makes that we can sell some of the slabs for a good. So sorting is actually not really the most exciting topic, but it's actually very crucial if you want to offer warranties, if what I want to say, on used products. This is another workshop at Rotor DC. It's the tile cleaning machine you will see just later on the video. So when we dismantle ceramic tiles, you will see there is a thick layer of mortar stuck on them on the back. And what this machine does, it's cutting off this mortar on the back of the tile. We used to do this by hand with a chisel and a hammer. But the result were a lot of broken tiles, and often the cement is harder than the tile itself. So yeah, the result was not great. The other technique would be plunging them in acid, just like the toilets, but it requires which requires, by the way, less manual work. But this only works for ceramics. So these tiles you see here, they are from cement, and of course they would just melt with the cement crusts on them. So as we had many tiles waiting which were not ceramic, and we knew many more would come, we considered investing in a semi-mechanized equipment. So it's a bit the first time we do this. We hired an engineer who could help us develop this machine to process more tiles on a quicker tempo. It was not a machine imagined from scratch. We just tweaked an existing machine to our needs, but we still do, with this machine, have questions about what kind of job we created. It's a lot of noise, you cannot hear it now. But if I would put it on, it's really unbearable. We have to wear a lot of ear equipment to be able to work there. It's very wet, very muddy. You cannot do it in the winter. You always need someone skilled close to the machine, because a lot of things can go wrong. The blades react differently to different type of tiles. So yeah, this is also why calls, what I was talking before about, to scale up, we often miss the point. So reuse is very diverse, unpredictable, as I said, and that's a big difference about how capitalist economy works in general. Yeah, reuse is a very local thing as well. It involves labor, and in an economy that struggles to recognize the value of labor, both economically and symbolically, this poses a serious obstacle to reuse. And yeah, so far, the reuse economy, at least in its formal forms, has managed to develop new markets for niches, new market niches for white-collar professionals. And compared to that, we see way less initiatives busy with really salvaging materials. So I'm ending with this example of AI trying to identify bricks on a wall, and what we really wanted to point out with this is that at this stage we think that it's more or as relevant to invest in sharing know-how, transferring skills. We value maybe craftsmanship, try to improve working conditions in reuse, than only rely on this digital innovation that would be the main driver of circular transition. I will.
Final topic we would like to address with you tonight is that of legislation, and more specifically legislation which is specifically aimed at reducing our material consumption or consumption of materials. And I will introduce it by briefly showing a project which has been one of the design assistance projects in the non-profit organization, so where we assisted a developer and architects with introducing reused materials in the project. It's a 1970s building, again, so some interesting parallels with this one, which pioneered the use of a welded steel structure for the floors above ground. And it's not an AI image. This is a side-by-side a picture of the 1970s and after its renovation. Now, this has become an example, or kind of exemplary project in Brussels for a shift in mentality towards the demolition of buildings from this era. And this graph shows you just the sheer amount of materials that were prevented from going to waste by maintaining the structure only, right? So the facade went, the finishings went, etc. But we kept the primary structure of the building, and you can see that actually most of the weight of the building is underground. It's the concrete parking floors and the foundations that had to go really deep because Brussels is very swampy. And can see that relatively only a small proportion, the orange bar, of materials have had to leave the building. So these were the facade and the finishings materials. Now, of course, the weight of these materials is not directly correlated to the environmental impact of them, but you can imagine that these amounts of steel and concrete do represent a significant portion of the environmental impact, the embedded CO2 and the embedded energy in these materials. We were called upon to assist on reuse specifically, so it was the developer's decision pushed by public officials and policymakers to maintain the structure. And one of the more practical merits of maintaining the building, besides avoiding all this waste, is also that if we were then looking for reuse, we didn't have to bother sourcing reclaimed structural elements. As I'm sure you can imagine, structural elements are a bit more trickier to reuse in terms of liability, in terms of logistics. It's literally the backbone of your building, so you don't want too many uncertainties when it comes to the structure. So it allowed us to, it actually made reuse easier, and it allowed us to focus mainly on finishing materials and technical installations. And this is an overview of the materials that we proposed, and as the image suggests, quite a few of them didn't make the final cut because they might have been too expensive, they might not have complied to certain norms, that might have been a material with which the contractor wasn't really comfortable working with. And I will just quickly show you through 3 operations that were successful, all 3 of which revolve around the reuse of natural stone. And I wanted to highlight this to talk about the challenges that come with reusing materials on a certain scale. If you're sourcing materials for a building of this size, I think it was around 40,000 square meters of renovated surface area, you really don't have too many options of materials to source that can satisfy such a need. And one of the materials we were able to source was a Belgian blue stone from a large square in Bruges, of which it was 6,000 square meters, so we only used a fraction of that for the entrance lobby. And then, of course, another potential source for materials might be very similar office buildings. This is a natural stone that we sourced from an office tower in Paris, and that we used as a floor for the terrace. And finally, a material that was sourced by Rotor Deconstruction that was dismantled in one of their early demolition or dismantling works from a 1970s bank building. It's a grey granite stone. Now, all 3 of these operations wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the network of salvage dealers that Victoria showed earlier that you can find on Opalis. So professionals who take the risk for us to decide to dismantle a material, to sort them, to clean them, and to offer them at a stable price. this just to introduce this evolution towards a different stance on the demolition of modernist architecture. The stone you see here was dismantled from the building on the left, a Brutalist bank building from the 1970s with extremely nice interior finishings. Which got entirely demolished in 2014, unfortunately. And only 4 years later, planning started on the Multi project. And here, the attitude already shifted a bit. So it was decided to not only maintain the building, but also maintain certain of its modernist architectural qualities, specifically the podium that was clad in bluestone. The facade obviously has changed quite radically, as you've seen. And this shift in attitude has actually resulted in quite a progressive piece of legislation, which was passed last year by the Brussels government. It's the new regional urban planning regulation, so which basically sets out the general rules for building and renovating in Brussels. And the first line of Article 4 reads, "Every existing building shall be maintained and, if necessary, renovated." So basically, if you want to demolish your building in Brussels now, you have to motivate that decision. It cannot be the result of just a simple calculation. Yeah, well, financially it's more interesting to demolish, so we'll do so. No, you have to motivate that decision, proving that it is either beneficial to the environmental impact of the project, that is beneficial to the surrounding area, etc. Now, this is a very interesting piece of legislation, and we really applaud it, and it's really the result of the work of a lot of policymakers, public officials, and also some developers that showed good examples, and architects that showed good examples. But we also have some questions about the effectiveness of such legislation, because as these design assistance projects, of which I just shown one example, one of the things they have provided for us is front row seats in Brussels' development world. And actually, we've been witnessing some tactics that developers employ to kind of circle around the idea of this legislation. Because the idea is, of course, to maintain structures of buildings, to avoid the consumption of materials such as concrete and steel to erect them. And one of those tactics that we've noticed is the very drastically shortening of renovation cycles. So this is a project, a building from 2008, for which Rotor was invited 2 years ago to already think about possibilities for reuse in the new project. So only 15 years after the erection of this building, high-quality office building. It had high-performance double glazing, heat recovery system, LED lighting, solar panels, you name it, it had it. But already it was up for renovation. So it's quite clear in this case, at least to us, that these works are not really satisfying an inherent need. They are not fixing an inherent problem with this building. What it does is it reintegrates the building into the market. And we ask ourselves, well, okay, demolition versus refurbishment is quite a clear-cut yes or no. But how would you legislate too soon of a renovation, too short of a renovation cycle? A very similar dynamic is happening within the interiors of these buildings. This is a still from one of the movies by Becca and Lemoine, and it shows a warehouse full of reclaimed office furniture. And this is a type of material that escapes legislation altogether, right? You don't have to submit a planning application to change your furniture or to change your interior decorations. And the reason materials such as these are consumed at a very high rate is because, as you might know, developers will not finish the buildings on the inside, usually. The interior finishings are left up to the tenants who use them. And as the leases of these office spaces usually don't last much longer than 6 or 9 years in most cases, that's also the lifespan of these materials. So this is a material flow that escapes legislation altogether. And I think what these two examples showed quite clearly is that apart from fulfilling a need, the activity of building is also driven by a sort of inherent need and drive for the newest and the latest and the greatest. Another tactic of dealing with this ban on demolition has been densification. This is a project, again, a 1970s office building, of which I showed you some pictures already in the very beginning of the talk. I think a surface of about 80,000 square meters that is being renovated. You know, in a world where there is a ban on demolition, there's actually quite a cheap bargaining chip for it. You know, the land in cities itself is quite scarce, so it's really hard to negotiate that. But actually, in that context, the sky is relatively cheap. So quite literally, in the urban planning regulations that make it harder to demolish, it actually makes it easier to extend building upwards. And this is a project where exactly such a thing has happened. So we're talking about an enormous building already, and yet for it to be a financially viable project in terms of the renovation, it had to be extended by about 10% of the existing surface area, which doesn't seem like a lot, but 10% of this building is 6,500 square meters. So basically you have to build a medium-sized building for, to make it possible to renovate a bigger one. We've actually done the calculation of the materials that will be used, consumed by this project. So we've measured all the materials in the bill of quantities of the architect. So this excludes the existing structure. It's only incoming materials. And so even in a careful renovation project, this is the proportion of concrete in that material. So again, this is weight, this is not environmental impact, but nonetheless, almost 3/4 of the materials are concrete for the slabs, for the extension upwards, for the screeds, and for the masonry. So even though in relative numbers, we are talking about a frugal project, we are maintaining the building, in absolute numbers, we are still consuming 30,000 tons of new materials, of which a big proportion is concrete. So where the other examples maybe show a drive for the new, this project quite clearly shows an imperative of growth. You can only build bigger to maintain what you already have. Now, this is not really to criticize the legislation or to say that it has no use. Maybe we can think of ways to improve it. We can look to Vienna, where a very similar ban on demolition exists, specifically for pre-World War II buildings. And there they actually accompany the legislation with active audits by the city administration on the proper maintenance of the building. So they check if you're actually maintaining your building so that you can't go, well, it's in terrible shape, I have to demolish it now. No, you also have to maintain it. We can also look to Portland, a city in the United States, where they protected not buildings, but specific materials. So specifically, again, older buildings, if you want to demolish them, you are obliged to reuse, not necessarily in the project, it can also be elsewhere, but you are obliged to reclaim certain elements. And again, if you don't reclaim them, you have to motivate that decision. You are obliged to work with certified demolition contractors who are skilled to dismantle them, and you have to contact salvage dealers to reclaim the materials. But somehow it's clear that legislation maybe isn't, or not in this form at least, the best way to address material consumption. Clearly there are some dynamics at play that kind of escape the logic. Or at least, and this is what we try to show tonight, at least if that legislation is incessantly focused on materials alone. The goal of the topics we address tonight is to kind of show that our building culture isn't only founded on the materials we use or the CO2 those materials represent, but also certain social and economic relations that are a bit trickier to address and that we maybe avoid a bit too easily. So how come it is more expensive today to dismantle a tile and store it somewhere in the city than it is to produce a new one on the other side of the world and import it? How come it is easier today to have dozens of people work on very expensive, high-maintenance digital marketplaces than it is to think of very easy ways to clean or dismantle these materials? Or how come a ban on demolition doesn't really grasp the flow of materials, or doesn't really result in a direct reduction of the consumption of materials. More than anything, our focus on reuse within Rotor has been a way to explore and expose these kinds of questions. And we've realized also along the way that reuse is by far a response to this question, or a sort of solution. We've experienced that firsthand. The very establishment of Rotor Deconstruction relied on dismantling materials from that bank building, which I already showed you a couple of times, which got entirely demolished. So our salvage business relied on the destruction of a building which we would like to preserve, actually. So this circular action or tradition can exist, not only exist next to this linear logic, but can even rely on it. And even though we have had some successful reuse operations by working with architects and developers, the sheer discrepancy of scale is quite humbling as well. Multi consumed about 25 times the yearly turnover in terms of weight, the equivalent of 25 times the yearly turnover of Rotor Deconstruction. We cannot really ignore the fact that we will never be able to satisfy this need or this scale of need for new materials. At the same time, it also consumed about half of the yearly turnover of Rotor Deconstruction in terms of reusing materials, which is also significant. And so I think the talk of tonight is really a plea to continue addressing the two together, to put things into perspective, to at once acknowledge that we are very much addicted to a linear logic of exploitation and extraction, but that at the same time we can also value these circular actions and see them as a potential way out without being blinded by it. That's something I think typifies our practice and that we think is necessary to keep a productive conversation on circularity going. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to both of you ask to join me to answer two questions before the movie, because that's what we usually do. And I have one question from Slido. So, how do material resellers obtain the materials from the demolition projects? Do they have to sign some contract during the project planning?
So how do materials come in?
Yeah. How the process of retaining them works? Because you mentioned a lot of things from the legislation, and in Czech Republic, for example, there is a problem with the disposal of the material, etc. So if there is something like kind of a contract that you have to have with the company that do the disposal of the building, or how the reseller obtain the material from the building, if there is some kind of contract during the deconstruction of the building, for example.
Yeah, it's very case to case. So in our case at Rotor Deconstruction, it's often. You
can go here for the light. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean in the light.
Yeah, very strict team there. Sorry, guys.
So I guess it's for large scale project. It's often the architects that would notice and want to do something about a building and ask the contractor to take a bit more time before dismantling or demolishing and look for some actors, not only Rotor DC, but to come and dismantle materials. Some of the things we do is also assessment and check before, and that has become, it's not yet an obligation in Belgium to do it, but in France it is. So for large-scale buildings, you have to have someone like us coming and check and counting the toilets. But I think mostly the architects, some of the architects like Multi, they just want it and they ask us or somebody else to.
Okay, I'll ask you if you have any questions here in the audience. Anyone? Yes, Stepan. There's Otto with microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you started with our building here, and I have a question about that because there is a planned reconstruction, and the idea that we refurbished, most of the things. I mean, it sounds wonderful, but the bottom line usually is finance. And is there what is the way? If we were to do it this proper way, it would just cost so much money. How do we motivate, developers and investors in general, and how do we make it financially more feasible in general? Do you see a way to make this process more financially feasible? I guess that's the question.
Well, some of the ways in which you can make it financially feasible are the tactics that I showed at the end, right? You can allow developers to renovate it more quickly so they can consume its materials more quickly. You can allow them to extend the building. Those are the tactics that they employ today in order to make renovation strategies such as those feasible. The question is then, that was kind of the point, do you then actually consume less materials if you do that? Probably in the end, not really, or not significantly. We also don't have to be, the building I showed, the multi-tower with the black and white and the colored one next to each other, we have to be honest about it. One of the most important reasons it was maintained was because it's an enormous building in the center of Brussels, and the developers would never be allowed to build a structure as big if they would start anew. So for them, it was a good opportunity to develop 40,000 square meters right in the center of Brussels. It wasn't the only consideration. Like I said, the kind of attitude towards demolition among city officials and policymakers already shifted, so they were also pushed. But it was for sure an important factor. I think in this case it's a bit different because it's less density compared to the area of the land. But I think in Brussels now, the last couple of years after Multi, there were some more buildings from that same period being renovated that also respected even more the architecture of that period. So Multi is, apart from the podium, the facade is unrecognizable. The volume has also been extended and thickened, so it's also kind of morphologically it has shifted quite a bit. But there have been other buildings where really this modernist character has been conserved, and the appreciation of that architecture has also increased by a lot in a very short period, right? The Bank building was demolished 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden we are appreciating this modernist heritage, and you can actually see a similar thing is now happening with postmodern architecture. So 80s, 90s architecture is now very slowly starting to be appreciated, although it's also very much stuck. Most of these buildings are private office buildings, so they are still very much in a private developer's logic. But so I think exploiting the architectural value, this building, it's amazingly detailed. If you restore it carefully, it would really promote the architecture of the place. And I think you just at some point need like a good precedent. And I think this building could. I'm not too up to speed with architecture in Prague. Maybe there are some good examples already, but I've heard that you're kind of struggling with getting this kind of architecture appreciated, and the same is still true in Brussels. But getting to convince maybe one developer or one building owner in doing it sets a super important precedent and kind of shows others that people actually, also young people, like this architecture. There's another very big project in Brussels, a modernist building as well, which I think also many people of a bit older people who've witnessed this building being erected might not like. But actually now there's a boutique hotel in it, and it's become fancy among younger people, and a bit what happened with brutalist architecture as well. So I think if you sell the idea to developers that young people like this architecture, maybe that's one way forward.
So okay, maybe the last question from the audience, yeah? Thank you very much. Welcome to discussion.
Good evening. Very inspiring. Thank you for your presentation. Maybe first to address your question, Stefan. I'm from Skanska. We did the demolition of Mercuria. I can tell you now the numbers. It's not more expensive to refurbish and to sort out all the waste and separate it. So that might be a good good point. My question to you would be, what do you do with the material? So we struggled a lot with logistics. To get the materials out of the building, that was a pretty big issue. And then to store it somewhere. So we were quite short of place to store it. How do you do it? Do you have a big logistics center around Brussels, or yeah? I'm just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ideas that is floating in Brussels, to have this this big shared storage place that would solve all of the problems. But we still did manage to have this. I think it's more complex than it sounds. But I think for most of the sites that we know about that had some space, they could store the materials on site. So that's the best, because you don't have to pay. If you want to store the materials elsewhere, like in this storage place, there is a rent attached to that. And that makes the material crazy expensive, because often the moment when you reclaim the material, or where you choose a material and you want to be sure that to work with this material and not the batch to flow out, you have to store it at least 2 years in advance. So 2 years of storage is a lot of money. So if you have to do it off-site, it's quite complicated. We know about some projects that were okay to pay that money, but it is an issue. I guess that the cost of the square meter of rent of storing these materials.
Okay, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, we have an introduction of the exhibition. So may I ask you for the short introduction? I will ask my colleagues if you can start the presentation. Again, there's the last slide about the exhibition, and I will ask Tom to show it to us.
Yeah, I prepared some slides with some pictures of the exhibition. We held it last year at Beaux-Arts in Art House in Brussels. The films you are gonna see now, they were parts of this exhibition, which was actually a monographic exhibition about a work of Rotor. It was the architecture magazine A+, that does this every year. So they invite every year an architecture office to do this. Since at that moment Rotor existed for about 20 years, we saw this as this exhibition as an opportunity to reflect on our own practice and look back and look at our place in the material economy of today. So that was a bit the pitch of the expo. We thought about how to do this, and we didn't want to again put some samples in a museum. So we thought film would be a good way to, a good medium for that. And also in many ways, film reflects also the way we the way we actually work, like visiting sites, talking with people on site, coming into direct contact with materials, etc. So we were looking for some filmmakers to work with us, and we contacted Bekalem1. Who were very happy to collaborate with us. So we, Rotor, selected 9 sites for them. They were all within this 200-kilometer radius around Brussels, which was very arbitrary. We didn't have anything with these 200 kilometers, but at least it kept it very local, because we wanted to make a point about our practice into the economy today and locally. So actually what we did was visiting the sites, making sure they were okay that we filmed. We gave some directions to Bekalem1, and then we just let them do their things. They went on a trip for 9 days, and they filmed the 9 films in 9 days. So that was also quite impressive of them. And so in the exhibition, maybe we can see it or not, you could see there was different rooms with films alternating with artifacts of our collections, archives, images, etc. So the idea was to make them dialogue together and reveal the complexity that we see in today's material flows. And so together they would tell stories that you will see now about the scale of industrial activity, the impact of material movement on landscapes, the realities of working conditions, for example. So what you're going to see now it's a condensed version. It's not the 9 films. It's a remake of BKLM1 to make it a bit shorter. The films, how you're going to see them now, are not very explicit. So we think it's good to let the images speak from themselves and that the viewers would make their own connection. But there is not a lot of information about the site. I think if you scan a QR code here, you can find more information, more background on the stories of the film, on the films themselves. So yes.
I'm sorry we're not able to start the presentation because we already switched the computers because we have to screen the movie from another one. So I'm very sorry. But we will see the series of movies in a few minutes. So thank you very much for the introduction. And I would like to ask you for applause for our guests, Tom Schonians and Victoria Van Kaan. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was so inspiring, especially in a situation when we are in front of the refurbishment of the building.